On behalf of the European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discrimination, my name is Francesco Di Lillo, and I welcome you to this webinar celebrating the 10th anniversary on from the adoption of the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief. As I said, my name is Francesco Di Lillo, and I represent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in Brussels, but today I'm wearing my hat as a member of the board of coordinators of EPRID. And before we dive into this conversation with Professor Annicchino, allow me to introduce you a little bit the genesis of this initiative. As EPRID, as a European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discrimination, together with friends and partners, we wanted to celebrate and recognize the importance of the 10th of the EU guidelines on freedom of religion or belief and commemorate their 10th anniversary. And so we hosted two roundtables during the previous month, where we discussed together with experts and guests the importance of the guidelines and some of their strengths and some of the weaknesses, and see how they are benefiting, and how we try to do an evaluation of this document after 10 years. We wanted to complement these two roundtables with a number of interviews with experts and academics, and such as Professor Annicchino, and that's why we hosted John Kinahan last week. Today we are hosting Professor Annicchino. Tomorrow we will hear from Dr. Andrea Benso, the Italian Special Envoy for the protection of freedom of religion or belief and interreligious dialogue. And then on Thursday, we will hear from Ari De Pater, who is the representative of the European Evangelical Alliance. And all of these efforts will culminate in our event that we're hosting on Monday, June 26th, here in Brussels, which will feature Mr. Frans van Dele, the European Commission Special Envoy for the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief outside of the EU, and Dr. Nazila Ghanea, the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And we hope that all of these efforts combined will help us, will contribute to raise awareness on this important document, but also look at its strengths and weaknesses, or any things that we can do to improve to raise the standards of the protection of freedom of religion or belief around the world. But without further ado, let's dive into this conversation. Professor Annicchino, thank you for joining us today. We are glad that you were able to be with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Francesco. It's a pleasure.
So the way we are doing this, I will be asking Professor Annicchino a few questions, and then I would invite already now, I would encourage those of you attending online to use our handy question and answer tool to submit your questions, so that we will be able to also take questions from you. So, Professor Annicchino, when we talk about the EU guidelines on freedom of religion, on the protection and promotion of freedom of religion or belief, what are we talking about, and why should we take the time to celebrate their 10th anniversary?
Thank you, Francesco. Besides thanking you and EPRID for the organization of this event, let me thank also the participants to this webinar. I see in the list of participants people which have probably more experience than myself in this field. So I'm very happy that they could take some time off their busy schedule to attend this event. Now, your question is, of course, a preliminary question. And myself as a lawyer, I'm going to give you first a legal answer to that, and then I'm going to dive into it. Now, I don't believe myself, I don't believe that I am an orthodox lawyer. I'm a rather unorthodox, in the sense that I don't think that law can explain everything, as some lawyers do. But we have to have, first of all, a legal focus here, and then we can move from there. Now, from a legal perspective, the first thing that we have to stress, and that was stressed already now at this point 10 years ago, is that the guidelines are a non-binding document, are a source that we could name as soft law. So are, let's say, instructions to different institutions which are called to implement them in their activity. Now, this can open a Pandora box or questions or doubt about the efficacy of the guidelines and so on. If you go back to the literature, you will see that there was already at that time a lot of debate. But then let me give you a second level answer to the question, what are the guidelines, after I have done my homeworks, my legal homeworks. Now, a more appropriate answer to the questions, what are the guidelines, in my opinion, is the guidelines were one of the first recognition after 2010 of the fact that religion and religious freedom can matter in EU policy making. Now, that's not an answer that we can take for granted, you know, because for years we have heard the narrative according to which the EU does not do religion. This was a common narrative in Brussels. This was a common narrative among scholars in this field. Oh, you study religion in public policy, so there is nothing relevant in Brussels for you, okay? And the guidelines, whatever we may think about the guidelines, that's a conversation that we can open, at least were a concrete recognition of the fact that the EU does religion. Now, this does not mean that the EU does well religion or does not well religion, but was, I mean, the guidelines were a recognition that religion was relevant for EU policy making. Let me stress also one thing. The guidelines were approved on June 24th, 2013. Now, I've also shared with you, with the organizer, an article which I wrote that year. That was published by the European Human Rights Law Review, which is a British journal. And actually, in that article, in the comment of that text, I noticed one thing. Be aware that 10 years ago, we were living in a world, especially in a Western world, especially North America and Europe, that was a little bit different. My impression that was a world which was much less polarized in terms of conflicting rights, especially the US, which is becoming increasingly difficult to understand for us Europeans in terms of, you know, polarization of the political debate, especially in this field. And the European Council approved the very same day the guidelines for the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief outside the European Union. This is the complete title of the guidelines. I mean, the outside, I think, is quite telling and relevant there. You know, sometimes there are single words in text that can reveal a whole word, and the outside there, I think, is particularly relevant. But the very same day, the European Council also approved the guidelines for the promotion and protection of LGBT rights, you know, which was, speaking in biblical terms, probably a sign of the times, if you want, of a polarization that probably was due to come in all the Western world. But at that time, in that June 2013, we were able to approve, the European institutions were able to approve those two documents the very same day. I don't know. So through a traditional legal analysis, these are all important things that you cannot fully grasp, but I think it's a contextual analysis which is much needed today for the kind of world we are living in.
Thank you. I mean, this is a very good icebreaker, and it's good that your eyes look at the details also on the name and title of this important document. Well, so I assume that your answer is that it is important, and there are reasons to celebrate this document. And so with that, how can the EU guidelines then support civil society organizations in effectively promoting and protecting the right to freedom of religion or belief? And in what you have seen, what are some challenges faced by civil society organizations in this field, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, I combined the answers to that also with the question that Joseph Young has already highlighted there on the impact, which is very much connected, I would say, to the question that you raised. First of all, the fact that there is a text, which now we can discuss on the text. I think that the text, for instance, if we are celebrating today the 10 years, I think that the text can be improved a lot. the text is too long, the text, can be made more effective. These are all discussions that we can have. But the fact that there is a text for civil society organization, freedom of religion or belief organization, I think it's already a first relevant step to hold the document in their hand and say, the fact that there is this document means that the institutions have to care about this right. If they don't have that text to make that claim, they would be weaker. That's, I think, and that's already a way to assess the impact. A traditional question is how effective have the guidelines been. Now, of course, if your assessment test is that every violation of freedom of religion or belief all over the world has been tackled and taken into account by the European Union, you will fail the assessment test. That's not the standard which I would use. That might be the standard that other people might want to use for a soft law document. I would not use that test because that test is doomed to fail, probably. I think that for a soft law document, the guidelines have had an important impact. The European institutions, of course, could have done better. There are a lot of contradiction. Just, for instance, take into account the recent meeting that there was in Tunisia between Ursula von der Leyen and the Italian Prime Minister with the situation in Tunisia and the deals which are going to be signed in Tunisia by the EU institutions. Of course, there are contradictions there. Sorry to say, life is contradictory and full of incoherencies. And I don't expect anything less from institutions if human life is full of contradiction and incoherencies. I mean, this is one of the immediate things that you learn as somebody raised in Catholic Italy, in the tradition. The contradictions are part of your life, whether you like it or not. Now, of course, contradictions can be improved, and the guidelines can be improved. Civil society organizations. The difference which I see, Francesco, is this: as somebody who comes to this also from the US experience. Not that I am American, even though I respect a lot, of course, the United States, but somebody who has studied the US. And the big difference I see is that in the US, you have a very dense ecosystem of civil society organization, plus you have a legal landscape which is stronger as compared to the guidelines that we have in Europe. You have institutions devoted only to this topic, so the ecosystem is stronger. But it's also stronger from the bottom up, not necessarily from the top down. Of course, in the US, it's stronger from the top down. You have the USIRF, you have the office in the State Department. You have a lot of institutions devoted to this task, but you also have an ecosystem of think tanks, organizations which produce idea in the topic of freedom of religion or belief. Those ideas are discussed and then are used as fuel to the machine of discussion on this topic, which I think is a little bit what is missing in Brussels today. Now, I'm not just saying that, civil society organization and religious organization are not doing enough. Also, ourselves, scholars, probably could do more. And I look forward to cooperate with all civil society organizations to shape a little bit the conversation into this. But also the religious demography is different. Whether we like it or not, in the US, in public discussions, religion is more relevant than Europe. So these are all set of challenges that both institutions and civil society organizations have to face when they want to claim the relevance of the right to freedom of religion or belief. Plus, there are difficulties on the field for civil society organization, and there is the interaction of this set of guidelines with other set of guidelines which the European Council has approved. The first that comes to my mind is the guidelines for human rights defender. So the people that work on the field to advance and protect and promote human rights. So there is a whole set of institutional plus societal difficulties that civil society organizations face and will face. But for me, probably if you ask me to indicate where would you work to improve the situation and indicate only one thing, I think that Brussels needs a more dense and wider ecosystem that can contribute to advance ideas and topics which then are brought to policymakers and then in the public discussion on this topic. That will be my initial focus. And we are all called to contribute to that, whether we are non-believers, whether we are Muslims, whether we are Catholic, because this matters to all of us.
Thank you. I mean, you shared a lot on even just on this question, and a lot to think about. But you mentioned something about weaknesses in Brussels, so let me ask you: is there a way? I mean, there are ways the EU guidelines can actually support and strengthen civil society in the way they are currently drafted, can they, are they a useful tool right now for civil society to engage, to be able to engage and be better equipped to address these issues, both, especially in the field?
Yeah. Now, as I said, the EU guidelines, as also other sets of guidelines, are relevant and are important. So this is my first claim. But my second claim, my subordinate claim, is that legal text guidelines do not live in a vacuum. They live in a context which is shaped by institution and by societal forces. Now, what are the institutional forces which shape the implementation of the guidelines? Is the interaction between the Commission, the European External Action Service, and because let's face the elephant in the room also here, the EU has also established a few years ago, as we all know, a position of special envoy on freedom of religion or belief, which is, I use here an expression which was used by Knox Thames in a paper that he wrote for a project on which I was working in the European University Institute at that time. He used this expression, the Tsar for freedom of religion or belief within the European Union. Now, we don't need to be particularly bright in assessment to say that, let's say it in a politically correct way, that there have been problems with the, full implementation of the position of the special envoy for freedom of religion or belief. We know that the position has been vacant for several months or years. We know that there has been a change of one person after a few months. So this, of course, weakens the implementation of the guidelines. If the guidelines live in this institutional setting, then they are weaker as compared to a set of guidelines on which civil society organizations rely, which are based on a strong institutional context. So my claim that we need to shape the public debate and reinforce the public debate and make it more dense is also connected to the assumption that this can contribute to reinforce the institutional scenario in which the guidelines operate. And these things are all connected, I would say. So yes, the guidelines can still be relevant even if they are not changed. But I would guess that if one day there will be an institutional revision of the guidelines, as it is written in the text of the guidelines, we might also think, and this initiative that you are undertaking can be a contribution to that, we might also redraft the guidelines in order to make them meet. I mean, the initial part of the guidelines has lists all the international standards. We all know where to find the international standards. I dream of a text which says why this is important for EU institutions, what are the tools available to EU institutions and civil society organizations, and how we achieve the goals that we want to achieve. So shorter guidelines, clearer guidelines, more to the point, and I think that that can be done.
Thank you very much, Professor Annicchino. Well, you mentioned the special envoy, and I think for the benefits of those that are following us and who may not know, the European Commission later then appointed a new special envoy. His name is Frans van Dele, and we will actually be honored to have him in during our next event on June 26th. So we hope that we'll take your invitation. We hope that he will be equipped with enough resources to be able to carry out his mandate and in a way that these important human rights deserve. Now, before I move to the next question, let me just remind our participants that this could be a good time to start sending in your questions, because time flies and we already see a couple. But it would be good if you use the tool so that we can address those right after. So thank you for those that are submitting questions right now. Professor Annicchino, you mentioned the LGBT guidelines at the beginning, together with the adopted at the same time of the freedom of religion or belief guidelines, and this brings me to the next question: how does or could the implementation of the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief, how do they intersect with the promotion and protection of other rights?
Well, yeah, no, that's an important question, because also raises the theoretical question of course, conflict of rights, given priority to one right or to another against the principle of indivisibility of human rights. So, of course, this is important. And because I think it's important to stick to the question that we deem relevant, this is also connected to the institutional framing which I was giving before. In Europe, in Brussels, as in the US, there are certain rights which receive more voice because the civil society organizations are more organized to push those rights into the agenda. For instance, take the difference in certain states, how much death penalty is fought against as compared to others, no? And I think this is all good when rights are at stake. But in this context, especially in EU policy making outside the European Union, if FORB is not heard, FORB will not be on the agenda, and other rights in implementation will be privileged as compared to FORB. So this is why I think it's important that FORB is advanced into the public discussion in Brussels, is perceived as visible and so on. Because otherwise, when the information goes top down to the delegation in the field, politicians in Brussels will take what is on the ground. And if FORB is not on the ground, FORB will not filter through down to the delegations and so on. So I think this reminds us of the principle that everything is connected and we are all connected, and rights need to be indivisible, but every stakeholder into this discussion needs to have its voice heard.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Annicchino. So I do have a last question for you, but I do see a few already submitted on the Q&A. So let me start from top to bottom. The first one from Katia Lane, and she's asking, what are the trends of counter-arguments toward the EU guidelines? How would you suggest to strengthen the guidelines against these arguments?
Well, counter-arguments depends to watch. I would use here the term weaknesses. There was a kind of review written by Professor François Fauré. You find it online. Was a paper of 2017 published by the College of Europe, if I'm not wrong. It's available online, free to read. And there you find some critiques in implementation, weaknesses, the fact that, for instance, national delegations say, oh, but we do everything at the national level. The EU doesn't count that much and so on. But again, these are weaknesses not of the guidelines per se, but these are weaknesses of the institutional scenario, not only of the EU, but only in the relationship of the EU in their relation with the member states. Now, let me say something again, which concerns me personally as an Italian. While Italy has the strange record from last week of having now 2 special envoys of freedom of religion or belief, even though with different titles a little bit. Now, this creates institutional confusion because you have the European level, plus you have the national level, but now you have 2 voices at the national level. And I mean, here you can have some discordance in the implementation of, when you are called to implement guidelines or any other set of tasks and tools for the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief. So I speak of my house before I speak of the house of the others. So, but again, my stress is on the institutions and not on the guidelines or the right per se, because when you have institutional dysfunctioning, that will be reflected in any kind of implementation of every right.
Thank you, Professor Annicchino. And you mentioned the Italian case, and tomorrow we hope to address that question directly to Dr. Benzo. Question from Knox Thames, who you quoted earlier on, and he says, while the guidelines were groundbreaking, they are one of many human rights documents, and as Pasquale said, are soft law. Would they benefit over the next 10 years if EU member states incorporated them, or a version of them, into their own laws and policies? It would create a reinforcing web of commitments. What's your opinion?
Well, of course, if the legal source institutionalizing the policy is stronger, probably the position of the person called to take action will be stronger. The point is that I see very difficult for an institution such as the European Union to, I don't know, create a regulation institutionalizing this. Would be enough for me to create. I mean, I think that the guidelines are already an important step if there is the willingness to create an institutional scenario where this is taken seriously, to do that. But then depends on the people who are called to implement the guidelines. For instance, the issue of training on FORB, which, was not something that we could take for granted 10 years ago. Trainings have been going on in Brussels. More people have been exposed to these ideas and so on. More discussions around table in Brussels around these have happened. So I think that as far as Knox's question is concerned, that, for instance, in legal terms, one thing that could be done is to intervene through the financial instruments of the European human rights tools, where, several and more initiatives could be sponsored and organized. That's already an important leverage that can be used.
Thank you. Well, the last question from the participants is from Inge Bries, and it says, you mentioned a couple of times that the ecosystem needs to be more dense. How do you suggest doing that? Or it is more a matter of increasing awareness or knowledge of policymakers how important religion is for a big majority in the world?
Well, I think that density is a key word here, because what does density means? You might have different lonely people that work into this field, everyone with its own idea. This does not create density. Density is created by the fact that you put these people in connection into an institutional scenario capable of giving more voice to the topics which are discussed. So a platform like EPRID could have a key role here in, connecting actors and amplifying their voice in Brussels. Is a thing that requires several skills. Require the capacity to build teams, require the capacity to discuss ideas, even with deep disagreements, which is a thing that not everybody possesses. Now, we know how much polarization in this field is relevant. This is why I have always warned against politicization of office in charge of the protection of freedom of religion or belief, which has been a tendency that we have seen. Because when you politicize institutions, then when the majority changes, the institutions are going to be wiped out. If you care about the promotion and protection of these rights, this is what you want to avoid. So you have to create a density which is also strong enough to resist politicization and polarization. It's a very challenging task, but it's the only way to preserve a healthy conversation and a strong conversation around this topic. Because if you politicize and polarize this topic, sooner or later, you are going to lose the elections. The part that supported you, because that's how life works. You are going to lose all the work that you have done. So this requires time, requires rumination, but can be done. And FORB-related topic, and this is an important topic given the, how much plural our societies are becoming in Europe. This is a conversation that will be relevant both internally and externally, also because sometimes people in the Foreign Office don't have very clear idea about the relevance of this topic. I can refer, without mentioning the state, of a conversation which I had with two officials of the European government, which contacted me via email saying, "Oh, we are doing an interview because we don't understand why other states don't understand our concept of secularism abroad. Our concept of secularism is so nice, and we don't understand when we engage with other countries like Indonesia and so on, why they don't understand our concept of secularism." Well, I said, because life is difficult and you cannot pretend that everybody agrees with your concept of secularism. So there is the need to have literacy on this topic available to professional and to non-professional, and make the claim that this is relevant.
Thank you. Another question popped up on the Q&A box, and it says, you mentioned that an institutional redraft could make the guidelines more relevant and more to the point. And how would then every state have the opportunity to have their voice heard in that process?
Well, it's from an institutional point of view, that's quite easy. I mean, the guidelines were approved by the council. The council represents the member states. So if the council goes into a drafting process or redrafting process of the guidelines, the states per se will have the voice on the drafting on this document. But to reclaim my point, I would wish very much that this redrafting process goes on in public, for what can go on in public, in the sense that there is a discussion, public discussion, on the fact that we are going to redraft the guidelines because these matter to us. And for instance, one initiative on this could be the presentation of a version of the guidelines which is redrafted and is sent to the council for consideration. This could be, for instance, an initiative to which we could all contribute.
So going back to the power of civil society, then.
Yeah.
That's where the civil society would have a role.
Yeah, of course. But then from a formal point of view, as we know, the guidelines were approved by the council, which is the institution that represents the member states. So that's the forum where member states will naturally have a voice.
Thank you.
And I mean, member states, of course, in a kind of contradictory way, but as I said, it's life, which is a contradiction many times. Have had different experiences with their own institutional special envoy. So now there is an expertise of 10 years which has been developed in different states, upon which we could build the new version of the guidelines, and we could benefit of the mistakes that member states have done over the last 10 years, you know?
So let's close where we started. 10 years ago, when the guidelines were adopted, you published the paper that you mentioned at the very beginning of our interview, and this paper commented on the guidelines as a milestone. And so in that document, you pointed out that, let me read it, that the challenge for the EU would be to find a new balance and coherence between the protection of human rights within the EU and policies to advance human rights abroad. So 10 years later, what is your assessment on this challenge? How do you think the EU tackled that challenge?
Well, the methodological assessment is that usually academics are very bad at doing predictions. So when you have published an article which is good on your resume, you don't go back to read what you have written, because 99% of the time was wrong. So the advice is never to go back to what you have written. In this particular case, this could be probably the 1% where I was right compared to the other 99%, in the sense that, you know, in the EU treaties, there is this principle of coherence between internal action and external action. Now, if you have problems with violation of freedom of religion or belief within the EU, and I think that you have problems also in major member states. I mean, I myself, I have criticized many times, for instance, France, and the policy of France as far as, for instance, Muslims are concerned, because this raises for the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief abroad an issue not only of coherence, which would be the legal term, but also of credibility of EU institutions. Because when you engage with partners abroad, they have an easy task in telling you, oh, wait, but you are violating the rights of Muslims in the EU, and now you come here telling us that we have to respect the rights of non-believers or Christian and so on. So this is why You remember that I said that in the title of the guidelines there was the issue of not in title of guidelines, but in the title of the special envoy, there was the title of outside the European Union. I think that you cannot have a disconnection between inside and outside, because if you have that disconnection, sooner or later that is going to fire back to you, as all the incoherencies that we experience in our life, whether in the public field or in our private fields. Incoherences sooner or later will backfire to us. And I think that, the issue of the coherence between internal and external action is still very much an issue at stake here.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Annicchino, Pasquale. I think I don't see other questions in the box, but I think this conversation was very interesting. You gave a lot of insights and food for thought for us to consider and to ponder on. But thank you again for being here with us. And as a reminder to all those of you online, I just posted in the chat links to get information and pre-register to our event on June 26th with the European Commission Special Envoy on freedom on the protection of freedom of religion or belief outside of the EU, and from Mr. Vandale and Dr. Nazila Ghanea, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And we hope to see you tomorrow and Thursday with our conversations with Dr. Benzo and Ari De Pater. And thank you again. Thank you, Pasquale, again.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we wish you a wonderful day.